Hi, I'm Tom, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio. Thank you for selecting my video. In today's video, I will be doing a demonstration and a review of the Stuv 30 compact wood-burning stove. I am the homeowner. We purchased this stove about 2 years ago, had some great experience with the installation and using the stove. I'm going to share with you everything that I know about it. Just as a disclaimer, I am not affiliated with the Stuv Corporation. I am not a certified Stuv installer or distributor or dealer. If you have specific questions, I recommend consulting the official guidance from the company or a dealer in your area. So just a few of the basics about this stove. The Stuv 30 Compact is about 1 meter in height or 40 inches. It puts out about 30,000 BTUs of energy, and it burns at 83% efficiency. Those are the vital statistics. This stove has some very unique features. Let me go through those. This stove burns outside combustion air. So in our installation, we have a outside vent coming in through the basement, and that outside air comes up through the bottom of the stove, basically through the floor into the stove as the combustion air. You can also bring in outside combustion air above the floor by running a vent pipe out right above the floor line to the outside. And it's also possible to run the stove using inside air. You'll want to consult the manual for how you do that. The company recommends using outside air for combustion air whenever possible. This stove vents out through a standard double-walled stovepipe and chimney setup. Consult with an installer or your local building department to determine all the clearances and requirements for basically the chimney venting of the stove. Those vary by municipality. So a few interesting features about this stove. It has 3 burning options based on this rotating cylinder. Let me demonstrate. Open the bottom door. There's a single cold grip universal tool that's used for all the operations of the stove. This door is called the night mode. This is where you would put the stove for maximum heat generation, or if you want to turn your fire down, it has a damper here. Turn this down at night and let it do a slow burn. That's called the night mode door. The second door is the open burning mode. You can burn this open. There's a removable screen that goes in place so you can smell and hear the crackle of the fire. That's the open burning mode. You don't get a real efficient burn in this mode, and the manufacturer is not recommending burning in this style very often because you're getting uncombusted material up into your chimney, and it's not the most efficient method, but it is possible to burn, and that's great for ambiance and for getting your fire started up. And then the third mode is the glass door mode. This is the most common method that we use. So you see the beauty of the flames in here while it's burning. You get tremendous heat coming off of the front of the unit. It burns super efficiently and quietly. So this is probably the most typical. I'd say probably 80% of the time that we've used the stove over the last 2 years, we've burned it with this glass door. A few features about this. The stove actually has a feature called glass wash feature, where it's basically taking hot air and it's bringing hot air up the inside of this glass door to keep the door from smoking up. So this stays incredibly clean compared to any other wood burning stoves or fireplaces that I've seen. The system also has a 2-stage combustion chamber. So you're basically burning the combustion once, then that hot air routes down and back up into a secondary combustion chamber. So you get a super efficient burn and a super hot fire through that secondary combustion. It's a real nice feature of the stove. The stove has a built-in flue control on the top. So based on the 3 different doors, it knows which door you're using, and it will open or close the diverter in the top of the stove as it goes up into the flue based on which of the 3 doors you're opening. So when you're using the open burn method, it'll open the flue all the way. That's why that doesn't burn quite as efficiently. When you're using this door or the night mode, it'll close that diverter down a little bit and give you a much hotter burn inside the stove. So it's controlling the amount of air that's going up through the flue based on the type of door that you're using. As I mentioned, it brings in outside air for combustion. It comes up through the bottom of the stove. You get a super hot burning right where that combustion air is coming in from the outside. And then interestingly, this also has something called the Riddler, which is a tool that, as you pull this, it basically grinds up the ashes and drops them down into the integrated ash pan. But as it's doing that, it's also clearing the path for where the combustion air comes in. So if you're starting to build up ashes in the bottom of your fire and you have an active fire going and you're not getting as much of that combustion air because you have a thick ash bed, you use this tool to pull the Riddler. It opens and closes a pair of interlocking plates that basically grind up the ashes, drop them down into the ash pan, and it frees up that path for the outside air to come in to improve your combustion. That's a real nice feature. In terms of maintenance and cleaning, I have a separate video that goes through all the maintenance and cleaning steps. This stove is incredibly easy and user-friendly to maintain and clean. Almost all these individual pieces come off. There are very few fasteners involved with the stove. It's all basically gravity-based panels sitting on pins. So the doors lift off, these side panels lift off, the top panels lift off, that bottom door comes out, the ash pan comes out. You can disassemble the vast majority of the stove without using a tool. And then when you do need a tool, I think there are 4 hex head bolts you need to basically disassemble all the user serviceable parts. Those all use one single tool, 10mm hex head. Everything else comes apart easily. Here's an example. Let's say I wanted to take this bottom door out. I just lift it up. It's just sitting on these pins. The pins act as hinges. Put it back in. There it is. All 3 doors come off that way. These 2 top panels come off. These 2 side panels are the ones with 2 screws in the top, but you can disassemble this whole thing really easily. The company also sells matching paint for this, so if you get scuffs or scratches or burn marks or anything on this, you can touch that up with the matching spray paint. And with that paint, you can also paint your chimney pipe. This is just traditional black stove pipe that we painted the Stuv gray to match everything. That's a nice feature as well. Let me get a fire started in here and I'm going to show you some more of the features when it's burning. Now, when you're thinking about what kind of wood you want to use in the stove, there are a couple of considerations. Obviously, the type of wood that you want to use is well-seasoned hardwood. My hardwood is locally cut here and typically seasoned for about 2 years. The woodman that I buy it from seasons it for about 1 year, and I typically buy a year's supply a year before I need it, and then I season it myself for another year. That's strongly recommended to get a real good burn. Then the other thing to consider is the size of the logs that you want to use. So you have a little bit of a small combustion chamber here, so there's a few things to think about. One is I have my woodman cut these logs somewhere between 12 and 14 inches typically. That's 30 to 36 centimeters. And at this length, they still will not lay down flat in there. You got to be, a good 2 inches shorter to get these to lay flat in the bottom. So I do have a few of these, based on the irregularity of the cuts. I get a handful of logs in each load, that will sit down in there crosswise, but they have to be pretty short. And usually I just use those for starting. Try to get a few of the small logs in there down low to start the fire using what Stuv calls the Upsidedown fire method. And then once it's going, these are the perfect size logs. These, 14 inch or 36 centimeters or so. They stand up in here real nice like this. So this is just more of a vertical combustion chamber or firebox than you're used to, but it really works. It's just a little bit different if you're used to throwing, big 18-inch 50 centimeter logs into a fireplace, you're just working with a little bit smaller material here. I also like to split these, so I get them a little thicker than what you're seeing here, and I split them down. They burn a little faster that way, which is good for starting the fire. Then I keep a small portion of unsplit logs outside, and we put those in once the fire is really going, because that gives you a longer burn. You don't get as much fast burn on those. And then just when you're thinking that stove looks too small, I don't want to be using those puny logs, here's one out of my outside fire pile. This is 18 inches, 45 centimeters long. That fits in there, and that's, I got room to spare. So you can put big logs in there. I mean, that's as big as I typically get for my outside fire pit, and that fits. To start my fire, I also use these little cedar kindling. I get these from a local woodman. And for the combustible fire starter, I use these are called fat wood. These are basically a type of pine, I believe, that are full of sap. This is all natural material. There's no chemicals added to these. And these light up just like a fire starter. These are really handy. So I usually put a few of these in. I put a few of those small pieces of cedar in. Those smell real nice and burn real hot right off the bat. A couple of small logs get this thing going. I have a separate demonstration that shows how to build a fire in the Stuv using the manufacturer's recommended method. They have a specific way that they recommend that you build your fire to reduce the amount of non-combusted material going up the flue. So in this part of the video, I'll show you the recommended method for building a fire in the stove. The manufacturer has a specific recommendation for how you do this. They call it an upside-down fire. What they recommend is that you put a couple of logs in first. Instead of putting your kindling on the bottom, put a few bigger ones in there. I get these small ones cut locally from a woodman that I know. He cuts 12 to 14 inch logs for me that'll fit in there sideways. Then on top of those logs, you basically want to build what they call your upside-down fire. So I put in a little bit of cedar. I got these from a local supplier who has a wood shop. Then you put your kindling on top of that, which seems a little counterintuitive, but that's what they recommend. And what this does is it basically burns the kindling first, rather than putting the logs on top of the kindling, where they're just going to smoke and basically burn all that uncombusted material. As you're starting a fire and the logs start smoking, you get a lot more uncombusted material going up through your flue and your chimney. So what this does is it basically gets the kindling going really hot, and then the kindling, as it starts to burn down, will light those logs on the bottom. So we're going to see how that works. I just use a couple of those little fat wood strips as well. Those are natural fire starting material. There's no chemicals in there. It's just the natural sap in that wood, and you can see how quickly those will light up here. I try to use one piece of newspaper or less. I don't like to burn a lot of paper in my stove. Now, as this gets going, they recommend that you close the door, but you don't use the glass door because that one will smoke up. So you turn this and use the solid night mode door. You don't leave it entirely shut. You open it 1 inch. So that's the recommended starting position. Once you get your kindling going, you open this one inch opening on the overnight door. Make sure that your damper's open all the way. And if you have outside combustion air, make sure that your outside combustion air is open all the way as well. I'm going to let this go for 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, that's been going for about 3 minutes. I got a nice updraft here now. I don't have any smoke coming out. So I'm going to add a little more fuel here. Now I use my little smaller split logs. I use a product called the Kindling Cracker from New Zealand to split my logs down into these small pieces. If you haven't seen that product, check it out. That's a game changer. And this is how you basically build a fire in here, is you build more of a vertical fire than horizontal. If you're used to a big wide box wood burning stove or a fireplace and you think about throwing logs in there horizontally, this is just a little bit different But what you're going to learn real quickly is that the logs burn incredibly well in this vertical position. So I'm going to let that get started up. Still leaving that door open a crack. That's been going about 5 more minutes. Let's see where we are. That's really cooking now. Got a really good draft, good outside air coming in. Those logs on the bottom lit up. That's a nice looking fire. So now let me demonstrate how the doors operate. Okay, now let me demonstrate how the doors work now that we have a fire going in there. So, as I mentioned, this is what's called the night mode. This is what's recommended when you're ready to shut the fire down and you want it to do a slow burn all night. There's a heat shield on the inside of this, so it's basically radiating heat back into the stove. It's not pumping as much heat out of the stove as when you have the glass door open. And if you really want to slow that down, push that damper down almost closed. And you can, if you really load it up with wood, it'll just barely keep hot embers in there all night. And the next morning you can usually restart a fire without needing to relight it. It'll just barely make it though. You got to really load it up with wood to get it to do that because the combustion chamber is a little bit small, but it's possible. So that's the night mode. This is the open burn mode. This is where, if you're doing this, you got to have this screen on here to keep your hot ashes from coming out. We like to burn in the open burn mode right when we start the fire. You hear the crackling, you smell the cedar burning in there that I used as kindling. This is really a nice way to get a fire going. And you're bringing a lot of that extra air in here, so you're getting a nice draft up through the chimney. You're burning up your wood a little bit quicker here because this isn't the most efficient burn. And you don't want to do this for a long time because when you do a less efficient burn, you're letting more impurities go up into your chimney. But this is a nice way to kind of get the fire started. And then once it gets going, you go to door number 3. This is the glass view door. This is the one we use all the time. So that's one of the most interesting features of this stove is that you can basically rotate that drum and change out the 3 doors while it's burning. That's really quite ingenious. There's one other feature of the stove that's actually kind of mind-blowing. So this stove is basically engineered so that you could either set it in a corner like we've done, you could install it flat against a wall, or you could put it out in the middle of a room. So you could put this stove out in the middle of an open plan room where you might have your kitchen, your dining room, your TV area. And the way this stove is engineered is that it will actually rotate while it's burning. Now, I don't have it set up for that operation because of the way we have it installed in this corner. There are stops that we put in here to make sure that it doesn't rotate, but I've temporarily removed them just so I can demonstrate that. So imagine if you had the stove sitting out in the middle of your open plan area, and you have it pointed towards your kitchen, and then you decide to serve dinner and you want to look at the fire while you're eating your dinner, you can turn the whole stove while it's burning. So now I can turn it towards my dining room. And then after you're done having dinner and you go retire to the living room for some beverages, you can turn the whole stove again 360 degrees while it's burning. It's unbelievable. I never saw anything like it. And there are stops in here along the way. Like I said, for my operation, I'm going to screw these stops down because we don't have this set up to be rotating. There's no need to rotate it for this corner setup. But that's a pretty amazing feature. How does that work? It's basically sitting on a ball bearing gasket and bushing on the bottom, and there's a ball bearing ring on the top. So essentially your outside air is coming up through the bottom. Your air intake is not actually attached to the stove. It's just a hole in the floor, and then there's a hole in the stove, and there's a separation between those with a rubber gasket around it that this ring is sitting on. So the entire stove can rotate without interfering with that outside air intake because it's coming up through the floor. And the chimney is essentially detached from the stove by this ball bearing gasket in here. So the entire stove can rotate on that ring with the chimney still intact. That's really an amazing feature. Next home that we have, we're going to put one of these out in the middle of it and rotate it 360 degrees. Some people ask what type of tools you need to work with this stove. Not many. Here's mine. I use one tool, this little mini poker. That's all I need. Helps me rearrange the logs in there. I haven't needed any other tool besides this in the 2 years that I've been using this stove. In terms of cleaning, every once in a while, I'll pull out my dustpan and a brush. This just doesn't, it's not as messy or as dirty as other fireplaces or other stoves that I've had in the past. It really keeps everything self-contained with that integrated ash pan and the integrated Riddler that basically drops the ashes down into the pan. This thing is really the easiest to clean stove or fireplace that I've ever owned, and I've had quite a few. So we've had this stove for about 2 years. We love this stove. Let me tell you about some of the features and what we like about them. The first one is the form. When we went out to look for wood-burning stoves, there are a lot of ugly wood-burning stoves out there. This is not one of them. This stove is gorgeous. It's nice to look at. It's unique that it's basically a tall stove, so the fire is really up here more in view than down here in a lot of typical wood-burning stoves. And this is a conversation piece in our home. We have a fairly contemporary design here in the home. It was difficult to find something that fit our style. When we have guests over, you know, this is a conversation piece. People want to know about the stove. So we really love that aspect of it. It's a very nicely designed, aesthetically pleasing addition to our home. The second thing is the functionality. I've had a number of wood-burning stoves and fireplaces over the years, and one of the features that I really look for is the ability to clean and maintain it. We've had this for 2 years. This stove is pristine. It looks today as good as it did the day that we installed it. It's very easy to keep clean. Based on the design, you get much less ash and debris coming out of the stove. So from a cleanliness perspective, we love it. The other functionality that we love is the 3 rotating doors. Now, some people might see that in a showroom and say, that looks like overkill. Do we really need 3 doors on our stove? You know, isn't one enough? The reality is that we use all 3 doors and they serve different purposes. So we like the open flame version. When we're starting up the fire, you hear the wood crackling, you smell the cedar burning. That's just an incredibly enjoyable way to get a fire going. Then once you have it going, we put the glass door. Beautiful to look at, radiates a huge amount of heat if you're sitting in the sitting area. And then at night, when you just aesthetically want to shut things down for the evening, you put it in the night mode. It kind of puts everything away. So we use the functionality of the 3 doors, I think, more than we even expected we would. The second point in terms of functionality is that the stove requires small logs. But once you start to use the small logs, they're actually much easier and cleaner to work with than big logs that we've typically used in our fireplaces or wood stoves in the past. So as I mentioned, the ideal size for these is somewhere between 12 and 14 inches. That's 30 to 36 centimeters. These are really nice to handle. They're easier to put into the stove. And you can put, you know, big ones in there. They just need to be short. So you can have some girth to them, which gives you a slower burn. You don't have as much surface area when you're burning those large logs. But you have to find a supplier where you can get shorter logs, in our opinion. You can fit big logs in there. These are the big, 18-inch, 46-centimeter logs. It's actually made to fit these in there. They're just harder to work with. So our recommendation is find a supplier where you can get 12 to 14-inch logs, which would be 30 to 36 centimeters is really the ideal size. Other functions we like is what's called the Riddler. That's the ability to agitate the ashes and drop ashes down into the ash pan, which frees up the path for the outside combustion air, which burns an incredibly hot, incredibly efficient fire. This is a real clean burning stove, in my opinion. The third feature we like about the stove is its heating capability. We haven't talked a lot about that. We don't use the stove as our primary source of heat in this room or in our home. It's really used for supplemental heat. But in the winter, if our room is typically at, say, 72 degrees Fahrenheit with our furnace on, that would be 22 degrees Celsius. Once we start up the stove, the furnace will turn off for the rest of the day, and we can basically maintain that 72 degree Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius temperature in a very large room. You can't see it on the camera, but this is a big open space room. It's almost 1,000 square feet, which is 90 square meters. This generates a lot of heat. Now this this model of the stove does not come with a convection air fan that blows warm air into the room. What we have is an aftermarket product. I just bought a small box fan that I put behind the stove. It's tipped at a 45-degree angle. I have that hooked up to a Wi-Fi rheostat controlled electrical outlet, so we can turn the fan on, we can turn it off, and we can turn the speed of the fan up and down. And what it does is it just blows air up over the back of the stove and circulates it in the room. Once that fan starts up, we can raise the ambient room temperature in the room by as many as, I'd say, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 1 to 3 degrees Celsius. And also, if you're sitting in the immediate vicinity of the stove, there's a sitting area right behind where the camera is. Just the radiant heat coming off of the front of the stove, it gets pretty hot. I'd say if the ambient room temperature was 72 degrees or 22 degrees Celsius, if you're within, say, 15 feet or 4 to 5 meters within the vicinity of the stove, it can get up to 77 degrees, which would be 25.5 degrees Celsius in the immediate vicinity of the stove. So it throws off a lot of radiant heat as well. So in summary, the form, the function, the heating capability, we love everything about this stove and we would recommend it. I encourage you, if you're interested in the Stuv 30 Compact, my information is 2 years old. This model is 2 years old. You should seek out the most up-to-date information from the company. You should find a local dealer and an installer, and you should consult with your local building department if you're interested in putting any type of wood-burning stove or fireplace in your home. Thank you for watching this video. Now let's talk about some installation considerations. Just as a reminder, I am not a certified installer of this product. I am a homeowner and an owner of this unit. I was involved in the installation, and I'm just sharing with you what was in the manual for the US Stuv America, the US version of this product. As you're thinking about installing any wood-burning stove, you should work with a certified installer. You should work with your local building department and ensure that you understand your local building codes. Those are the things that will really drive the way that you do the installation and the specific type of product that you can use. I'm just going to share with you my experience here as informational only. So the first thing that we had to look at was will the stove fit in the space that we want to put it in? So we're in a really tight corner here, and that was part of the reason that we went with this unit, because if we used a traditional rectangular stove, it would have had to come way out from this corner, which would have been in this doorway, and it would have blocked the ingress and egress into that room, so that wasn't going to work. So we basically were looking for something that we could fit really tightly back into this corner. And both the shape of this, given that it's just a very, very small footprint for a wood burning stove, and the ability to have it fairly close to the wall were two of the features that we were interested in. So you want to look at the required clearances around a unit before you install it. So some of the clearances that are required here is on the back and side of the stove. You need 8-inch clearance, which is 20 centimeters between the stove and any combustible materials. That's a real important one because that determines how tight it can be against your wall. It also depends on what type of material you have on your wall. We put up the stone material, so that's not combustible, so we could get pretty close to that. Then behind the stone, we put up a product called Scamotech from the Scamol company. And that's basically a fireproof wall board, so that's not combustible either. So now I'm already 5 or 6 inches, past where the wall is before I start to hit the wall studs, which are my closest combustible material. So we could have theoretically even put this tighter back against the wall. I wouldn't recommend that. But you want to figure out your clearance from combustible materials in the back and the sides. A couple other clearances to think about is you need 48 inches from the stove to any combustible materials out here. So we have a dining room table over there that's out of range from where you can see. That has to be at least 48 inches away. If you have sofas, chairs, carpeting, whatever, you got to basically have a 48-inch clear perimeter out here in front of the entire stove of any combustible materials. And then the last thing is that you need a 84-inch minimum ceiling height, which is 213 centimeters. We didn't have a problem here because we have real high ceilings, but that's important as well. The second thing to consider is in terms of the floor protection. You need 18 inches from the front of the combustion chamber to the combustible materials on the floor. This floor pad is provided by the Stuv company, and it covers that exact distance, 18 inches, which is 46 centimeters. So I recommend at least looking at the product that comes with the stove or is provided by the company. And then I just moved the camera down to show you the floor plate. As I said, this is the recommended Stuv floor plate for this specific configuration where it's fixed in the corner at this 45-degree angle. This just gives you the required clearance out here before you hit the hardwood. This is just big enough, in my opinion. We didn't want to have anything bigger coming out than this because we have this doorway here going into the kitchen. But if this were in a different part of the house where we didn't have the ingress and egress going right past here, I probably would have opted for a little bit bigger floor cover. We've never had any ashes fly out and hit the hardwood floor, but it's just a little bit of a tight area when you're working with the logs and hot ashes and things of that nature. So that's just something to keep in mind, is if you want to put down tile or a bigger floor cover or something like that. This one definitely works. It keeps everything compact, looks gorgeous, but it's just big enough. And then the other thing that's real important is it depends on the type of installation. This is a fixed installation where we're not doing the rotating stove. You can rotate the stove 360 degrees. Once you start rotating it, you need to have those clearances around all the possible angles that it could rotate. So the only way we could put it in this tight of a corner is to put the stops in here so that it's in a non-rotating fixed position. Once you decide that the stove will actually fit where you want it, then you need to figure out, do you have any other obstructions that are going to come into play? And we did. So there are a few things to think about. One is you need to determine where your chimney is going to go. I just moved the camera up so you could see where that chimney goes out through the wall. And again, there are certain requirements on how many elbows you can have in your chimney, what the distance is. So consult with a professional on all those questions. So our chimney goes up, and it's out of frame here, but it goes through the wall to the outside, up through a chimney chase that we built on the outside of the house through the roof. And then I believe there's a 10-foot clearance required above where it comes out through the roof. Consult with your local building code or ordinances to figure out what that clearance is. But basically, when we decided to go up and out through the wall here, we had to do some framing work because we were going right through some of the framing. So we had to move some studs and do a little framing to clear an opening for the chimney. So it's important to figure out, really important, where's your chimney going to go? And there are all kinds of clearances and requirements for fireproofing around the chimney that are well beyond my area of expertise. So consult with a certified installer and your local building department on the chimney. That's probably the most important thing and the most technical aspect of what you need to figure out. The second thing is that you need to figure out where your intake air is coming from. Because this is a closed chamber, it requires air intake. The Stuv company recommends that you bring air in from the outside. There are two ways to do that. One is above the floor, right through the wall. You could have a vent coming from the outside. Because we have a basement below this location, we went down through the floor and then out through the basement wall. So there's basically a dryer vent looking attachment outside, bringing air in. It then goes through a flexible duct in our basement. It goes through essentially a flow control that's like a carburetor control. That's controlled by this lever down on the floor. That brings the outside air in. And then that comes up right through the floor. So we had to drill, I believe, a 3.5 inch hole through the hardwood floor to bring that air up into the bottom of the stove. That's the combustion air that comes in from the outside. That also raised some issues because right where we were going to bring that air intake up, there was a floor joist right down the middle of where we were trying to hit. You have a little bit of flexibility in terms of where that needs to come up. It doesn't need to be centered exactly under the stove, but we decided to reframe some of the flooring to move that joist out of the way so that it wouldn't conflict. And we also just beefed up some of the floor joists under this area, not so much because of the stove. This only weighs about 220 pounds, but because we also added all this stone as well. So we just added a little extra support under the floor. That's also something to consider. You also need to consider where your electrical is, because we had an electrical outlet right behind where the stove is. We had to rewire that and move the electrical outlet. We also had 4 light switches on this wall that couldn't remain here because they were too close to the stove. So we had to move some electrical as well. So we had a little bit of framing work, a little bit of electrical work, and then the big additional construction was building the chimney and the chimney chase outside. One other thing you can see from this shot is that we also painted the chimney pipe, stove pipe to match the Stuv color. This is really a nice way to dress this up. This is just standard black stove pipe, but we ordered a couple cans of spray paint in the Stuv gray and went over this with a couple of coats of spray paint that really dresses up the entire finish. I really strongly recommend that if you're into the maintaining the aesthetics of the whole look here. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I wish you the best of luck on your future projects.